There is a specific kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got last night. It is the tiredness of a life that has been running on the surface of things for too long. The tiredness of spiritual routine without spiritual encounter, of religious activity without genuine presence, of knowing all the right things about God without having been recently undone by Him. You have been in the valley a long time. You have been doing the work, showing up, going through the motions, maintaining the appearance of a faith that, if you are honest in the private hours of your life, has felt more like a habit than a living relationship. And somewhere underneath the tiredness, there is a longing you haven't quite let yourself articulate, because articulating it would require admitting how far the current reality is from what you know it could be. The longing for more, for higher, for the real thing, whatever the real thing actually feels like when it arrives. Jesus called 3 people away from the crowd, not 12. Not all the disciples who had been following him, who had heard the teachings and witnessed the miracles and been present for every public moment of his ministry. 3. Peter, James, and John, the inner circle of the inner circle. And the invitation he extended to them was not a detailed briefing about what was going to happen. It was not a theological explanation of what they were about to witness and why it mattered. It was simply, come. Follow me up the mountain. The reason would become clear when they got there. The meaning of the climb would be revealed at the summit. But the climb itself required a prior decision, made in the absence of information, in the pure simplicity of trust. Yes, I will follow you up. The mountain is traditionally identified as Mount Tabor, or, in some scholarly opinion, Mount Hermon, a high peak, a physically demanding ascent, the kind of climb that takes hours and involves genuine exertion. The disciples were not taken to a comfortable hillside with a gentle trail and a scenic overlook. They were taken up. The original language emphasizes the height, a high mountain, apart from everything else, separated from the noise and the crowd and the ordinary geography of their days. Every step up the mountain was a step away from something, away from the other 9 disciples, away from the crowds who followed them, away from the demands and the voices and the constant press of human need that characterized everything about their life. With Jesus at this stage of his ministry, this separation is not incidental to the story. It is the story's first essential element, because what God was about to show these 3 men could not have been shown to them in a crowd. Not because God is incapable of encountering people in crowded places, he clearly is not, but because what they were about to see required the quality of attention that only comes when everything competing for that attention has been left behind. The crowds would have immediately tried to make something practical out of the vision. The other disciples would have had questions and reactions and opinions that would have filled the air between them and the experience. The mountain demanded the kind of aloneness that creates a specific kind of receptivity, the stripped down, nothing else available, undistracted openness that allows what God is doing to land at its full depth, rather than being cushioned and processed and domesticated by the surrounding social environment. When was the last time you climbed? Not a literal mountain, though perhaps that too. When did you last separate yourself deliberately, with intention, at cost, from the noise and the routine and the comfortable horizontal pace of your ordinary life, and go somewhere higher with God? Not to perform a spiritual discipline, not to check a box, but because the longing underneath your tiredness was pointing you towards something that the valley cannot provide, the encounter that the crowd cannot witness, the conversation that requires the crowd to be behind you and the summit to be ahead, the specific kind of meeting with God that happens not in the busy middle of things, but in the costly, chosen aloneness of a mountain that not everyone is invited to climb. The 3 disciples who followed Jesus up that mountain did not know what was waiting for them. They were tired from the journey down from Caesarea Philippi, where Peter had made his great confession, They were carrying the weight of what Jesus had begun saying about his coming death, words that none of them fully understood yet. They were ordinary men in an ordinary state of confusion and faith and physical exhaustion. They put one foot in front of the other. They followed the figure moving upward ahead of them. They did not ask for a preview. They climbed. And that climbing, that ordinary, costly, uninformed, trusting, one step at a time, following of Jesus into the unknown higher, was what positioned them for the most extraordinary visual encounter any human beings had yet experienced in the history of the world. The summit was coming, but it required the ascent first. Every step of genuine spiritual progress requires the willingness to leave something behind. Comfort, control, explanation, the safety of the familiar level, and follow Jesus into whatever altitude he is calling you toward. The crowd stayed in the valley. The 9 stayed below. 3 climbed. And the 3 were about to see something that would recalibrate every category they had for who Jesus actually was. The invitation was a mountain. The instruction was to follow. The qualification was willingness. And the only thing that could disqualify a person from making the climb was the decision to stay where they were. You were made for the mountain. The valley has its place, and we will talk about that later in this story, because coming down is as important as going up. But right now, the invitation is upward. Whatever has kept you in the comfortable horizontal of spiritual routine, whatever version of the 9 who stayed below, you have been choosing when Jesus was calling you. To the 3 who climbed, today is the day to put your foot on the path. He is ahead of you on the mountain, and what is at the top will be worth every difficult step it takes to reach it. They reached the summit. Jesus began to pray, and then something happened that no human language is fully equipped to describe, which is perhaps why every gospel account that records it reaches for metaphors and comparisons, rather than direct description reaching for the most extreme version of light available in human experience, and then pushing past even that. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light itself. And Mark, whose account tends toward the understated, adds that no bleaching process available in the world could have produced that whiteness. This was not a reflection of external light. This was light emanating from within. The humanity of Jesus, the familiar carpenter's body they had walked alongside for 3 years, was in this moment, becoming transparent to something that had always been inside it, and what was inside it was blinding. Think carefully about what the disciples were actually seeing in this moment. They were not seeing Jesus become something he had not previously been. They were not witnessing the addition of glory to a previously ordinary person. They were seeing the lifting of a veil that had always been there, the ordinary, unremarkable physical appearance that had allowed Jesus to walk among people without their being immediately destroyed by the full weight of his divine reality. The transfiguration was not a transformation. It was a revelation. It was the moment when the thing that had always been true about Jesus became, for a brief and overwhelming period of time, visible to human eyes. And this is the question that the Transfiguration puts directly to every person who has been following Jesus for any length of time. How do you see him? Not as a theological concept, not as a historical figure, not as a source of comfort and guidance and moral instruction, though he is all of those things, but as he actually is. As he was on that mountain, the blinding, overwhelming, light-radiating Moses and Elijah deferring, Father-declaring reality of the Son of God in his unfiltered glory, the one in whom all the fullness of the Godhead dwells bodily, the one before whom the most powerful figures in human religious history stood as witnesses and subordinates. That Jesus, the one the disciples had been eating breakfast with, who borrowed their boats and called their names and wept at their grief and grew tired and asked for water, that same person was simultaneously, always, continuously this light, this glory, this overwhelming, prostrate-inducing, impossible brightness. Familiarity is one of the most spiritually dangerous conditions available to a person who loves Jesus. Not because familiarity means you have been closeness to Jesus is entirely good and entirely the point. The danger is when closeness produces a domestication of the divine. When Jesus becomes so familiar, so regularly encountered, so woven into the ordinary rhythms of your spiritual life that you stop actually seeing him. When he becomes the companion of your routine rather than the Lord of your awe. When your prayers become conversations with a trusted friend rather than approaches to the throne of the one who spoke galaxies into existence. When the face that shone like the sun on the mountain is, for all practical purposes of your daily experience, just the face of the nice man who loves you and helps you with your problems. Peter would later write as an old man, with all the theological depth that decades of reflection had given him, that they had been eyewitnesses of his majesty. The Greek word he used was megaliotes, the condition of being supremely great, of possessing a greatness that surpasses all comparison and exhausts all description. He wrote it as a present reality, not a past memory, as a truth that continued to organize his experience of Jesus long after the mountain. The majesty he had seen on Tabor or Hermon was not a temporary special effect. It was the permanent truth about the person he was still following decades later. The glory did not stay on the mountain. That is the point of this chapter and one of the most important truths in this entire story. The mountain was the place where the veil was temporarily lifted so the disciples could see what was always true and would always be true. And having seen it, they could never again look at the familiar, ordinary, human Jesus and fail to know what was behind the familiarity. The carpenter who got tired still carried that light. The friend who wept at Lazarus' tomb was still the one whose clothes had outshone the capacity of any bleaching process in the world. The hands that broke bread at the table were the same hands that had, for a moment on a mountain, radiated the uncreated light of divinity. This is the gift the Transfiguration offers you today. Not a new experience to seek, not another spiritual high to chase, a recalibration of how you see the person you are already following. He is not less than you have sometimes reduced him to in the comfortable familiarity of your devotional routine. He is not smaller than the category of personal Lord and Savior that, for all its theological accuracy, can over time become a comfortable and manageable container for something that was never designed to be contained. He is the one whose face shone like the sun. He is the one for whom Moses and Elijah appeared as supporting witnesses. He is the one about whom the Father spoke from a cloud, identifying him as beloved, as the source of divine pleasure, as the one to whom all listening must be directed. That is who walks with you in the valley. That is who asks you to follow him up the mountain. That is who you have been casually calling Lord, while sometimes barely pausing your scroll through social media to acknowledge him. Look up, look again. This is who he is. They were not alone on the mountain. The text tells us that two figures appeared alongside Jesus in the luminous cloud of the Transfiguration, and the disciples recognized them by prophetic instinct, by the visual indicators the tradition had preserved, by whatever means God gave them, to identify what they were seeing as Moses and Elijah, the two towering figures of the Hebrew religious world. The man who had stood on Sinai and received the law from God's own hand, whose face had glowed with residual divine glory for days after the encounter, whose influence on the shape of Jewish faith was so foundational that the law was simply called Moses by the people of his tradition. And the most dramatic prophet in Israel's history the man who had been taken up in a whirlwind, who had called fire from heaven, who had stood alone against the prophets of Baal and watched the altar burn, who had never died in the ordinary sense, and whose return was expected by Jewish tradition as the herald of the Messianic age. These two men were present on the mountain, in glory, flanking Jesus, and they were talking with him. Luke gives us the content of the conversation, which Matthew and Mark do not record. They were speaking about his departure, which in Greek is his exodus, the specific, deliberate death by crucifixion in Jerusalem that was coming, that Jesus had recently begun to tell his disciples about, and that they had not been able to receive. Moses and Elijah, the two great representatives of the law and the prophets, were present on the mountain talking with Jesus specifically about the cross. This is one of the most theologically dense moments in the entire gospel narrative, and one that rewards extended contemplation. Every word Moses ever wrote, every law he ever delivered, every detailed instruction about sacrifice and blood and atonement was a thread pointing forward to what was about to happen in Jerusalem. The Passover lamb was Jesus. The mercy seat was Jesus. The scapegoat was Jesus. The whole elaborate system of temple worship that Moses had constructed under. God's direction was a working model, built to scale over centuries of the single event. It prefigured the Son of God, willingly offered, bearing the weight of human sin, dying the death that justice required, so that grace could be given without injustice. Moses knew this on the mountain. He had been working on this story for the entirety of his ministry, and now he stood in the presence of its fulfillment. Elijah had prophesied. He had announced the word of the Lord in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. He had stood alone in the darkness of Israel's spiritual apostasy and declared that the God of Abraham was real and the gods of Baal were empty. Every fire he had called from heaven, every miracle he had worked, every declaration he had made was downstream of a single conviction: God would act. God would vindicate his people. God would send the one who would do what no prophet, no priest, no king, no human effort could accomplish. Elijah had been waiting for this his entire ministry, and now he stood in the presence of the one who was it. What the disciples were witnessing on that mountain was not two great men paying their respects to a great teacher. They were witnessing the whole of redemptive history converging on a single point. The law was there. The prophets were there. And in the center, the brightest figure, the one the other two were flanking and attending and speaking with, was the fulfillment of everything both of them had pointed toward for the entirety of their existence. Jesus was not one figure among three. He was the reason the other two were there at all. He was what they had both, from their own angles and in their own generations, then building toward across the whole of their ministries. Now here is why this matters for the person watching this today. Your own story is not a collection of random episodes. Your suffering, your seasons of waiting, your experiences of failure and restoration and unexpected provision and unanswered questions. They are not unrelated events strung together by coincidence. They are chapters in a single narrative that has a center, and that center is Jesus. The way Moses and Elijah's entire ministries were revealed on that mountain to have been pointing forward to Christ, every thread of your own story is being woven by God, who sees the whole design from the beginning into a tapestry, whose center and organizing principle is the same person who stood in blinding light on that summit. You are not the author of your own story. You are a character in a much larger one, written by the one whose face shone like the sun, whose death was the subject of a conversation between the two most significant figures in religious history, whose resurrection is the hinge on which the entire narrative turns. The parts of your story that don't yet make sense are not mistakes. They are threads whose meaning will only be visible from the vantage point of a later chapter, or perhaps only from the perspective of eternity. Moses and Elijah spent their lives building towards something they never fully saw. What they built pointed perfectly toward what they saw on the mountain. Your life is doing the same. Peter opened his mouth. This is, in the Gospels, almost always the beginning of something significant. Sometimes gloriously right, like the great confession at Caesarea Philippi, just days before this, and sometimes gloriously wrong in a way that is simultaneously embarrassing and deeply endearing. On the mountain, Peter did what Peter always did in moments of overwhelming divine encounter. He tried to do something about it. Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Mark, with characteristic bluntness, adds the editorial note that Peter did not know what he was saying, because they were all so frightened that coherent thought had become approximately impossible. But let's be fair to Peter before we laugh at him, because Peter's impulse is not as foolish as it first appears. He was responding to the most overwhelming spiritual experience of his life with the tools available to him. He wanted to do something. He wanted to make the moment permanent. He wanted to build a structure around it, to give it a container, to create a way for the experience to remain, rather than dissolve back into the ordinary, as he sensed it inevitably would. The proposal to build 3 shelters was not theologically sophisticated, but it was deeply, recognizably human. It was the instinct to stop time, to hold the high place, to refuse the descent. You know this instinct. Every person who has ever experienced a genuine spiritual high knows this instinct. The worship conference where God broke through in a way that left you weeping and recalibrated, and certain that your life was going to be permanently different from that point forward. The retreat where the presence was so thick that driving home on Sunday evening felt like returning from another country. The prayer meeting where something happened that you cannot fully describe to people who were not there. And you know that the memory of it will become both comfort and ache comfort, because it was real. Ache, because it fades. You wanted to put up a shelter. You took notes. You journaled extensively. You bought the worship album. You made commitments. You told yourself this feeling would not leave. And then Monday came, and Tuesday, and the dishes, and the traffic, and the meeting that went long, and the relationship that was still difficult, and the prayer time that felt like speaking into a wall. And the shelter you tried to build turned out to have no walls that could contain what you had experienced. Not because the experience was not real, because experiences of the divine are not designed to be sheltered. They are designed to be carried not as preserved specimens under glass, but as living fuel for the long walk down the mountain and through the valley that follows. God did not let Peter build the shelters. The proposal was interrupted, gently and completely, by the arrival of the cloud. The bright cloud that enveloped the entire summit was not a punishment for Peter's poorly conceived construction project. It was a redirection. It was heaven saying what you have just proposed is understandable, and it is not what I am going to allow, because the purpose of this mountain is not to give you a dwelling place above the valley. The purpose of this mountain is to give you something to carry back into the valley. You cannot stay here. You were not brought here to stay. You were brought here to see, and having seen, to go. The American church has a particular relationship with what I might call shelter building. The entire infrastructure of the modern Christian experience is in some ways organized around the replication and extension of the mountaintop, the conference circuit, the worship experience, the emotional peak of the Sunday service designed to produce the effective experience that makes people feel God was there, the spiritual high made reproducible through the right combination of lighting and music and preaching cadence. None of these things are bad in themselves. but they become profoundly limiting when the faith they produce cannot sustain itself without them. When the Christian whose faith is functioning well looks like someone who has recently come down from a conference, and the Christian whose faith is struggling looks like someone who has been in the valley too long without getting their emotional tank refilled. Jesus does not build shelters on mountains. He calls people up them and then walks them back down. The mountain is real. The encounter is real. The glory that was revealed is permanently true and permanently relevant. But the mountain is not the destination. It is the preparation for the destination, which is always, in the economy of God, the valley below, where the people are, where the need is, where the broken boy is waiting at the bottom, and the disciples who stayed down have been arguing and failing and needing someone who has been with Jesus in the high place to come back and do something about it. Build nothing, carry everything. The descent is coming, and it is as important as the ascent. The cloud came, not gradually, not as a slow atmospheric change, but as an immediate, enveloping divine presence that descended on the entire summit and covered them completely. And the disciples, who had already been overwhelmed by the visual glory of the transfiguration, fell face down on the ground in terror. The Greek word Matthew uses for their fear is the same word used throughout the New Testament for the specific kind of fear that is the appropriate human response to direct encounter with the holy. Not the fear of danger, not the fear of pain, but the fear of being in the presence of something so categorically greater than yourself, that your instinctive response is to make yourself as small as possible in relation to it. They were face down, eyes closed or buried in arms, unable to look, unable to stand, the entire weight of their bodies, voluntarily surrendered to the ground, because standing in that presence felt like an impossibility. And from within the cloud, the voice of God the Father spoke. The same voice that had spoken at Jesus' baptism in the Jordan, when the Spirit descended like a dove, and the Father declared his pleasure in his Son to the crowd. The same declaration now on the mountain to these three particular people. This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. And then one additional word, one command, one instruction that was not present at the baptism and that distinguishes this declaration from the one at the Jordan. Listen to him. That is the entire additional content. 3 words. 2 in Greek, autou akuete. Listen to him. Hear him. The one I am telling you about, the one whose face shines like the sun, the one with whom Moses and Elijah appeared on this mountain. Listen to him above every other voice, every other authority, every other source of instruction available to you. This command needs to be heard in its full context to appreciate its radical scope. The people to whom it was spoken were the inheritors of the most sophisticated religious tradition the ancient world had produced. They had the law of Moses, the entire revealed ethical and ceremonial code that God had given Israel as the framework for their relationship with him. They had the prophets, centuries of divine speech delivered through inspired human voices, recording God's purposes and warnings and promises in forms that had been preserved and studied and argued over for generations. They had the rabbinical tradition, the accumulated commentary and interpretation of the greatest minds in Jewish history, applying the text to the questions of every generation. They had religious infrastructure, religious education, religious community. They had, in short, a great deal to listen to. And the Father, standing these 3 disciples on a mountain, where Moses and Elijah had just been present, pointed at Jesus and said above all of that, listen to him. Not instead of Scripture, Jesus himself said he had come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. But as the authoritative interpreter, the living embodiment, the final word to which everything else points and in the light of which everything else is understood. Every scripture, every tradition, every theological category you have inherited, bring it all to him. And when his voice and any other voice are in tension, listen to him. This is the command that the modern American Christian needs to hear above almost any other, precisely because the noise available to the American Christian in 2025 is unprecedented in human history. There are podcasts for every theological conviction. There are social media accounts for every spiritual aesthetic. There are celebrity pastors, theological controversialists, worship movements, deconstruction communities, reconstruction communities, complementarian voices, egalitarian voices, prophetic voices, cessationist voices, an absolute cacophony of Christian opinion and Christian instruction and Christian identity formation, all competing for the finite bandwidth of a person's spiritual attention. In that noise, the Father's instruction from the mountain is not a polite suggestion. It is a lifeline. Listen to him, specifically, directly, personally, to the voice of Jesus as it speaks through the text of Scripture. In the quiet of prayer, in the accumulated wisdom of genuine encounter with the living God. Not to the loudest voice in the Christian media landscape. Not to the theological position that makes you feel most sophisticated. Not to the spiritual aesthetic that most appeals to your personality. To him, the one whose face shone like the sun. The one Moses and Elijah came to stand beside. The one the Father loves. Listen to that one, specifically and primarily and above all, the competing noise. The disciples were face down when the voice finished. And then they felt something that changed everything about the terror they were in. We will talk about that touch in the next chapter. But the command landed first, before the comfort came. Hear it before you reach for the comfort. Listen to him. Everything else follows from that. They were on the ground, face down, every muscle in their bodies communicating the same thing. We cannot stand in this. The weight of what they had just witnessed. The transfiguration. Moses and Elijah, the cloud, the voice, had done what genuine encounters with divine holiness always do to human beings. It had collapsed them. Not metaphorically. Physically, their bodies had given way beneath them, responding to the presence of the holy with the only posture available to creatures in the presence of their Creator. Flat on the ground, faces down, small as they could make themselves. This is not weakness. This is the accurate physical expression of a correct theological reality in the presence of what they had just encountered. Standing up would have been the inappropriate response. And then something touched them. Jesus came and touched them. The same hands that had been radiating impossible light. The same figure whose clothes had outshone all the bleaching processes of the known world. The same person in whose presence Moses and Elijah had appeared as attendants, and the Father had spoken from a cloud. He came to where they were. He knelt or bent or reached down. The text simply says, he came and touched them. And the touch said something that the entire preceding spectacle could not have communicated on its own. It said, I am still M, the one you know, the one who walked with you on the road, the one who called your names, the friend, the rabbi. He was still that, simultaneously and without contradiction, even in the full unveiled light of his divine glory. And he said, get up, don't be afraid. 6 words. 3 commands. Rise. Do not be afraid. It is only I. The most powerful being in the universe was telling 3 terrified men that the appropriate response to his presence was not prostration and paralysis, but rising. Not the casual, distracted rising of people who have not been encountered by the holy. The rising of people who have been prostrated and have been touched and have heard a voice that says, up, now. because there is work to do and road ahead and a valley below that needs what you have just been given. Don't be afraid. And the word translated, don't be afraid, me phobiasthei in Greek, is one of the most frequently repeated commands in the entire New Testament. Jesus says it more often than almost any other single instruction. It is spoken to the disciples in storms, to women at the empty tomb, to Paul in prison visions, to John on Patmos. Don't be afraid. The repetition is not because the instruction is simple, but because the condition it is addressing is persistent. Fear is the default position of human beings in the face of the unknown, the overwhelming, the divine, and the demand to go somewhere that requires more of them than they currently feel they have. Don't be afraid. The instruction is always given in the direction of mission. Rise and go. The fear you are feeling is real, but it is not the last word, and it is not the obstacle it appears to be. When the disciples lifted their faces and looked around, two people were missing from the scene. Moses was gone. Elijah was gone. The cloud had lifted. The blinding light had subsided. And what remained, what was left when all the spectacle had dissolved and the overwhelming supernatural elements had retreated, was simply Jesus. Ordinary in appearance, standing there, the same face they had seen over 1,000 shared meals, the same voice that had taught them and corrected them and asked them questions they couldn't answer and held them through storms at sea. The same person on the other side of the most overwhelming experience of their lives, still just there, present, sufficient. Matthew 1:78 records it with a simplicity that deserves to be read slowly. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. No one except Jesus. After everything, after the glory and the cloud and the voice and the terror and the prostration, no one except Jesus. This is the destination of every genuine spiritual encounter, no matter how dramatic. Not the experience itself, not the memory of the experience, not the theology built around the experience. The person, the one who was there before the spectacle and remained after it, the one who did not require the spectacle to be present, who was present in exactly the same way on the mountain before the transfiguration began and after it ended. No one except Jesus. This is the bedrock truth that is available to you in every season. The high ones and the flat ones, the ones that feel like mountain summits, and the ones that feel like they will never produce anything but the gray of ordinary days. He is there, without the light show, without the clouds, without Moses and Elijah and the Father's audible voice. He is still there, in the same unchanging way that he was on that mountain before and after the glory broke through. His presence is not calibrated to the emotional temperature of your spiritual season. He is not more present when you feel him most, and less present when you feel nothing. He was there when the glory was visible, and he was there when only he was visible. And he is here now, in whatever condition this day finds you, saying the same thing. He said to those three terrified men on the ground, "Get up, don't be afraid. It is only I." They came down the mountain. Jesus had told them not to speak about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had been raised from the dead. Another instruction they could not fully understand yet. Another piece of information without a complete context to put it in, carried in faith, because the one who gave it was the one they had just seen transfigured. They came down carrying the vision without being able to share it, holding the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to them in silence, returning to the ordinary world with the weight of the extraordinary still alive in their bodies and their minds. And the ordinary world was waiting for them, not patiently. At the base of the mountain, a situation had developed in their absence that the other 9 disciples had been unable to resolve. A man had brought his son, a boy, seized by a spirit that caused him to fall into fire and water that had been destroying him since childhood, that would throw him to the ground and make him convulse and produce a suffering that was both terrible to witness and apparently intractable. The man had asked the 9 disciples to drive out the spirit. They had tried and failed. And by the time Jesus and the 3 came down from the mountain, a crowd had gathered around the scene of the failure, and teachers of the law had arrived to argue about it. And the whole situation was a tableau of religious inadequacy and human desperation colliding in the noise and dust of a very ordinary afternoon. From the Father's voice in the cloud to the noise of the crowd, from Moses and Elijah to a failed exorcism and a theological argument, from the summit where heaven and earth intersected to the base of the mountain where the gap between the two had never felt more acute. The descent was as stark as descents get. Jesus had known what was waiting at the bottom. He had walked down the mountain into it deliberately, without pausing at a scenic overlook, without sending someone ahead to manage the crowd. He came down from the glory and walked directly into the mess, because the mess was the point. The mountain was not the destination. The mountain was the preparation for the destination, and the destination was always the valley where the boy was suffering, and nobody could help him. Every person who has ever had a genuine mountaintop experience knows what the descent feels like. The worship conference ends. The retreat is over. The powerful Sunday gives way to Monday. And Monday does not gradually reintroduce the ordinary. It arrives all at once, with its full quotient of difficulty and noise and demand and disappointment. The boy at the bottom of the mountain is always waiting. The spiritual high does not protect you from encountering the depth of human need when you come back down. If anything, the contrast can make the encounter more disorienting, having been where you were, to now be here with what you saw now, feeling inaccessible in the dailiness of where you have landed. The spiritual crash after a high experience is one of the most universally documented phenomena in Christian life, and one of the least talked about honestly in Christian community. Because the dominant cultural narrative of the American church tends to tell success stories, the mountain, the glory, the transformation, and has less infrastructure for the honest. Acknowledgement that coming down from the mountain into the ordinary valley is genuinely hard, that the feelings don't last, that the commitments made at the retreat don't automatically sustain themselves in the Tuesday morning of the following week, that the gap between the person you were on the mountain and the person you feel yourself to be in. The valley can produce a specific kind of spiritual grief that is not the same as doubt and not the same as failure, but is real and requires acknowledgement and pastoral care rather than the implicit message that if you were really faithful, you would be able to maintain the mountaintop state indefinitely. Jesus did not maintain the mountaintop state. He came down, he walked into the crowd. He dealt with the failure of the disciples who had stayed below, the inadequacy of their faith, the suffering of the boy, the skepticism of the crowd. He did all of this immediately, without transition, without a buffer period of readjustment. And in doing so, he modeled the only thing that makes valley faith sustainable. Not the preservation of mountain feelings, but the carrying of mountain truth into valley reality. The glory he had just revealed on the summit was not less present as he walked among the crowd. It was simply less visible. The same Christ who had shone like the sun was now casting out a spirit with a word and restoring a convulsing boy to his father. The power was the same. The mode was different. This is what mature faith looks like. Not the perpetual mountaintop, the consistent valley, navigated with the truth that was deposited on the summit. Here is the truth that the entire story of the Transfiguration has been building toward, and it is both simpler and more demanding than any of the individual elements that preceded it. The glory that was revealed on the mountain did not stay on the mountain. It came down. It walked into the valley. It stood in front of a crowd of arguing people and a suffering boy and a father at the end of his hope. And it spoke a word and cast out a spirit and gave the child back to his father. And then it kept walking. It walked toward Jerusalem, toward the cross, toward the events that Moses and Elijah had been discussing with Jesus on the summit. And it kept walking after that, through the resurrection, through the ascension, through the Spirit's coming at Pentecost, through 2,000 years of church history, and all the way into the specific, ordinary, undramatic geography of your life today. The same Jesus who was transfigured on that mountain is the Jesus who is with you right now. Not a diminished version. Not a Jesus whose glory is in remission during the non-spectacular seasons of your life. The same one, fully present, carrying all of what he was on that mountain into all of what your day currently contains. The dishes, the commute, the meeting that went sideways, the prayer that felt like speaking into a wall, the relationship that is still difficult, the season that is stretched longer than you thought you could sustain. He is in all of it. Not loud, not with visible light and audible divine voices, but with the same unchanging, undiminishable reality that was present on that mountain, whether the veil was lifted or not. This is the reorientation that the Transfiguration offers to the person who has been chasing the feeling of the mountaintop. Not a rebuke of the longing for spiritual experience. The longing is right and good and should not be suppressed, but a redirection of the object of the longing. You are not looking for a feeling. You are following a person. And the person is here, in the valley, in the ordinary, in the flat and gray and apparently uneventful Wednesday of your spiritual life, just as really and just as fully as he was in the moment that his face shone like the sun. The feeling may or may not come. He is here regardless. Peter's suggestion to build 3 shelters failed because it was addressed to a problem that did not exist. He was trying to make the presence permanent by constructing a dwelling place for it. But the presence was already permanent. It had always been permanent. The Transfiguration did not create the presence of God in Jesus. It revealed it. And what is permanently real does not need a shelter to maintain it. It only needs to be known deeply, trustingly, increasingly, across the years of a life that moves through many seasons of altitude and many seasons of valley, without the truth of who Jesus is ever changing. The Father's command from the cloud, listen to him, is not a mountaintop instruction for mountaintop seasons only. It is the daily instruction for the entire life. Listen to him when the presence is palpable, and the worship is powerful, and the feelings are running high, and the whole enterprise of faith feels effortless and alive. And listen to him when the presence is quiet, and the worship is dry, and the feelings are absent, and the enterprise of faith feels like a choice made against the evidence. Especially then. Listen to him especially then, because what he says in the valley is the same as what he revealed on the mountain. It is just received without the assistance of extraordinary sensory experience, which means it must be received in the pure strength of trust. And that trust, built up over the patient seasons of the valley, is worth more than all the feelings the mountain ever produced. The disciples came down and saw no one except Jesus. That is the final posture. Not the mountain, not the cloud, not the voice, not Moses and Elijah, not the spectacular and the overwhelming and the emotionally conclusive. Just Jesus. Ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in reality, walking beside you into whatever is at the bottom of the mountain, fully capable of doing in the valley everything he was revealed to be on the summit. He doesn't need the light show to be who he is. He is who he is in the Tuesday morning. He is who he is in the dry season. He is who he is when nothing shines and nothing vibrates with glory and the world looks exactly like the world, and the boy at the bottom is still waiting, and the crowd is still arguing, and the valley is still the valley. He is just him, and just him is enough. It has always been enough. Let that be enough today.